My hand violently trembled as I tapped the screen to open my banking app, tears burning down my cheeks while I sat alone in the dark leather interior of my car. "Get this beggar out," my father had sneered to the entire room just moments ago, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. My mother's eyes had deliberately avoided mine as security gripped my arm, like I was a criminal. My heart pounded against my chest, not from fear, but from a sudden, terrifying realization. I looked down at the screen glowing in the dark car. The balance read over $100 million. I took a shaky breath, knowing that with one single swipe their entire world would shatter, and they would never see it coming. Betrayal has a steep price. My name is Maya Sterling, and at 32 years old I never expected my own father to throw me out of my sister's engagement party like a stray dog. To them, I was just Maya, the family failure, the one who refused to marry rich and could apparently barely afford rent. To the rest of the business world, I was the silent CEO of MS Holdings, the very venture capital firm that now owned the debt on my father's failing media empire. But they did not know that yet. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. And if you have ever had family who treated you like a burden only to realize they needed you later, hit that subscribe button. This story is for anyone who has been underestimated. Just 5 minutes ago, I had walked into the Vanderbilt estate in Newport, hoping for a truce. I wore a simple beige dress because I did not want to outshine my sister Keisha on her big day. That was my mistake. As soon as I entered the grand ballroom, the jazz music seemed to stop. My father, Reginald Sterling, marched over across the marble floor, his face turning purple with rage. "You have some nerve showing up here looking like a maid," he hissed loud enough for the wealthy guests to hear. I tried to speak to tell him I was there to save his company, but he cut me off with a wave of his hand. He gestured to the security team. "Remove this beggar, she is ruining the aesthetic of the party." My sister Keisha laughed, sipping her champagne, while my brother-in-law Brad looked at me with pure contempt. As the heavy oak doors slammed shut behind me, pushing me out into the cold night air, I felt something inside me snap. I sat in my car looking at the bank balance that proved I could buy and sell everyone in that room. I wiped the tears from my face and looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The sadness was gone, replaced by a cold, burning rage. They wanted a beggar, so I would show them what happens when a beggar buys the throne. I flipped down the sun visor and pulled out the worn photograph I kept tucked behind the mirror. It was a picture of my grandmother Rose, taken just weeks before she passed away. She was the only person in that entire mansion who had ever loved me. To my father Reginald and my mother Vivian, I was simply the mistake that happened before they perfected their gene pool with my sister Keisha. But to Nana Rose, I was the future. I traced the edges of the photo, feeling the familiar ache in my chest. I had not come back to Newport tonight for the free champagne, or to beg for my father's acceptance as he claimed. I came back because of a promise I made on a deathbed. I remembered the smell of antiseptic in the hospice room where my parents had dumped her so they could go on a cruise. I sat holding her frail hand while she whispered the secret that would eventually bring this family to its knees. She told me where to look. She told me about the cooked books, the shell companies, and the loans taken out in my name when I was a minor. My father thought he was a genius businessman, but Nana knew he was a thief. She made me promise to get away to build my own strength, and to come back only when I had the power to take it all back. And I did exactly that. I spent 10 years eating instant noodles and working 20-hour days on Wall Street, while my sister posted vacation photos on Instagram. I built MS Holdings from a laptop in a studio apartment into a financial predator that swallowed weak companies for breakfast. And the weakest company of them all was Sterling Media. My father had no idea that the anonymous investor buying up his bad debt for pennies on the dollar was the same daughter he just humiliated. He thought he was dealing with a shark, but he did not know the shark had his blood. I looked at Nana's smile in the photo. "I tried to do this the nice way, Nana." I whispered to the empty car. "I brought a fair deal. I was going to let him keep the title of CEO. I was going to let him save face. But he had to call me a beggar. He had to insult me in front of the very people he is trying to impress. The sadness in my chest hardened into cold steel. I tucked the photo back into the visor. The nice daughter died the moment the security guard grabbed my arm. I was not going to leave. I was going to go back in there, and I was going to burn his legacy to the ground using the very matches he handed me. It was time to show them exactly what a beggar looks like when she owns the bank. I stepped out of the car into the cool night air, my heels clicking against the pavement. I walked around to the trunk of my Aston Martin, which I had purposely parked behind a row of hedges so no one would see it. My father thought I arrived in a cheap taxi. He had no idea I drove a car worth more than his life insurance policy. I pressed the button, and the trunk hissed open, revealing a black garment bag. My armor. I grabbed it and slipped into the shadows of the pool house changing room, a place I used to hide in as a child when my parents fought. But I was not hiding anymore. I unzipped the bag and the fabric spilled out like liquid ruby. It was a custom-designed silk gown, red as fresh blood and sharp as a blade. I stripped off the beige department store dress I had worn to look harmless. I let it drop to the floor and kicked it aside. That dress belonged to the old Maya. The Maya who begged for scraps of affection, the Maya who let them walk all over her. She was dead now. I stepped into the red silk and pulled it up my body. It fit perfectly, hugging my curves and demanding attention. I turned to the mirror above the sink. The lighting was dim, but even in the dark I could see the difference. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small black velvet box. Inside sat a pair of flawless diamond drop earrings, 4 carats each. My sister Keisha was currently inside bragging about her engagement ring, which I knew for a fact was a lab-grown stone Brad bought on sale. These earrings, however, were real. They were cold, heavy, and worth a fortune. I fastened them to my ears and watched them sparkle. They were not just jewelry. They were a statement. They said, "I do not need your money, I have my own." I applied a layer of deep crimson lipstick, my hand steady as a surgeon's. I stared into my own eyes in the glass. Goodbye, Maya the beggar. Hello, Maya the CEO. The woman staring back at me looked dangerous. She looked expensive. She looked like she was about to ruin everyone's night and enjoy every second of it. I fluffed my hair, letting it fall in loose waves around my shoulders. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the night jasmine and the impending chaos. They wanted a show. They wanted drama. They wanted to humiliate someone to make themselves feel big. Well, I was about to give them the performance of a lifetime. I grabbed my clutch, which held the documents that would seal their fate, and pushed the door open. The click of the lock sounded like the safety coming off a loaded gun. It was time to reintroduce myself. I slipped through the heavy steel service door, escaping the cool night air for the chaotic heat of the catering kitchen. The noise hit me instantly. It was a symphony of clattering pans, shouting line cooks, and the aggressive chopping of knives against wood. This was the underbelly of the party, the frantic engine room that kept the luxury running upstairs. I moved with confidence, my red silk dress rustling softly against the industrial tile floor. I needed to cross this war zone to reach the main hallway without being announced by the front doorman. I kept my chin high, acting as if I owned the building, which technically via the debt structure I almost did. Suddenly, a large man in a pristine white chef coat blocked my path. He was red-faced, sweating profusely, and screaming at a sous chef about undercooked scallops. He spun around and saw me. His eyes raked over my dress and then settled on my face with a look of pure disdain. "Hey you," he barked, pointing a ladle at me like a weapon. "No groupies in the kitchen. The exit is back that way. We do not have time for lost little girls trying to snag a rich husband. Get out." He was Chef Laurent, or at least that is what the menu said. In reality, his name was Larry, and he was from Ohio, but my father paid him triple for the fake accent and the attitude. He stepped closer, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. "Did you hear me?" I said out. "Or I will have security throw you in the dumpster where you belong." I did not flinch. I did not step back. Instead, I looked past his angry red face to the row of wine bottles sitting open on the stainless steel counter behind him. My eyes narrowed. I recognized the labels immediately. Chateau Margaux, 1982. A vintage that cost more than this man made in a year, and he was ruining it. I locked eyes with him and let a small, amused smile play on my lips. Actually, I am looking for the sommelier. I said, my voice calm, but cutting through the kitchen noise like a razor. I switched effortlessly into flawless Parisian French. Because if you serve that Margaux without decanting it for at least another 45 minutes, the sediment will completely destroy the tannin structure and ruin the pairing with the lamb. Surely you know that high tannins react poorly to oxidized fats if not properly aerated. The entire kitchen seemed to freeze. The sous chef stopped chopping. Larry's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He blinked rapidly, his brain trying to process the shift. He had assumed I was a nobody, but nobodies do not speak fluent French about wine chemistry. The arrogance drained out of his face, replaced by sudden panic. He realized he might have just insulted a VIP guest, or worse, a food critic. "Oh, madame, pardon," he stammered, wiping his sweaty hands on his apron. "I did not realize. I thought you were simply lost." I stepped around him, my heels clicking rhythmically on the floor. "I am not lost, chef," I said, switching back to English but keeping the icy tone. "But you might want to check those scallops. I can smell them burning from here." I pushed through the swinging double doors, leaving him scrambling in panic behind me. As the doors swung shut, the noise of the kitchen vanished, replaced by the soft hum of a string quartet. I was in. And I had just won my first battle of the night. The heavy double doors at the end of the service corridor were the only thing separating me from the lion's den. I took one last deep breath, filling my lungs with the cold, recycled air of the estate. I signaled the two waiters standing guard, and they pushed the mahogany panels open. The sound of the party hit me first. A wall of polite laughter clinking crystal, and a string quartet murdering Mozart. I stepped through the threshold, and for a moment time seemed to suspend. The red silk of my dress caught the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead, blazing like a flare in a sea of beige and pastel chiffon. I walked to the top of the grand staircase that overlooked the ballroom. One by one, heads began to turn. It started as a ripple and quickly became a wave of silence. The string quartet actually stopped playing as the cellist lost his place, staring up at me. I did not look down. I looked straight ahead, locking eyes with the portrait of my great-grandfather hanging on the far wall. I felt the heat of 300 pairs of eyes on me, assessing the dress, calculating the cost of the diamonds, and wondering who this intruder was. In their world, anonymity was the ultimate sin, but wealth was the ultimate forgiveness, and I reeked of wealth. My eyes scanned the room and landed on the head table. There she was, Keisha, my little sister, the golden child. She was holding court in a white lace gown that probably cost more than my first car. She was laughing at something Brad whispered in her ear, but the laugh died in her throat when she saw the room looking at me. She stood up, her face twisting in confusion. She squinted, trying to place the familiar features beneath the professional makeup and the confident posture. She did not recognize me. To her, Maya was a slumped-over shadow in a hoodie. This woman in red standing above her like a Judgment Day angel was a stranger. I saw the envy flash across her face, raw and ugly. She hated me instantly, not because I was her sister, but because I had stolen her spotlight. She tapped Brad on the shoulder, pointing at me with a manicured nail. I could read her lips perfectly from across the room. "Who is that bitch?" I smiled, letting the question hang in the air. The game had officially begun. Brad finally stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized my face. The confusion in his expression slowly morphed into a sneer of disbelief. "Well, well, well," he said loudly enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Look who decided to play dress-up." He circled me like a shark inspecting a wounded seal, his gaze lingering mockingly on the silk of my gown. "I almost did not recognize you without the smell of desperation, Maya." Did you rent that by the hour? Or did you steal it from the coat check? A few of his groomsmen snickered behind him, clinking their glasses. Keisha let out a high-pitched laugh, her relief palpable now that she realized the threat was just her loser sister. "Oh my God, Maya," she gasped, clutching her chest. "You actually think putting on a fancy dress makes you one of us? You look like a child trying on mommy's clothes. Take it off before you rip it and have to pay for it." I stood perfectly still, my expression unreadable. I did not defend myself. I did not explain that the diamond earrings I was wearing cost more than Brad's entire student loan debt. I simply looked at him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a lab rat. Before I could respond, the crowd parted violently. My father, Reginald, came charging through, his face a dangerous shade of crimson. He looked like a man on the verge of a stroke. "You," he hissed, spitting the word out like poison. "I told you to leave. I told you to get out of my sight." He grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging into my skin with bruising force. The music had stopped completely now. The entire ballroom was watching the great Reginald Sterling manhandle his own daughter. "You are doing this on purpose, aren't you?" he whispered, his voice trembling with rage. "You want to embarrass me. You want to humiliate me in front of the Montgomerys. Do you have any idea how important this merger is? I will not let a failure like you ruin my legacy." He yanked my arm, trying to drag me toward the exit, but I planted my feet firmly on the marble floor. I did not move an inch. The heels I wore were designed for boardrooms, not for running away. I looked down at his hand gripping my arm, then up into his bloodshot eyes. The old Maya would have cried. The old Maya would have begged for forgiveness. But the woman standing in front of him now was not his daughter. She was his creditor. And you do not manhandle the person who holds the deed to your life. "Hand off, father," I said, my voice calm and deadly quiet. "Unless you want a lawsuit for assault added to your list of problems, I suggest you let go, right now." The threat hung in the silent air, heavy and absolute. For the first time tonight, I saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. He realized too late that the beggar he threw out had returned as a warrior, and he had just made the mistake of declaring war in front of an audience. Reginald let go of my arm as if he had been burned. The red mark of his fingers was already forming on my skin, but I refused to rub it. I refused to show him even a flicker of pain. Instead, I smoothed the red silk of my dress with slow, deliberate movements. A waiter was passing by, his hands shaking so hard the crystal glasses on his tray rattled against each other. I reached out and plucked a flute of champagne from the tray, my movements graceful and controlled. I took a sip, letting the bubbles settle before looking my father in the eye. "I am hurt, father," I said, my voice calm and carrying effortlessly across the silent ballroom. "I came here to celebrate my sister, to wish her well on her big day. Why are you so afraid of me being here? Do you think I am going to steal the silverware?" The question hung in the air like a thick fog. It was a masterstroke. By remaining calm while he was hyperventilating with rage, I had flipped the script. I was no longer the intruder. I was the poised guest, and he was the unhinged aggressor. I saw Mrs. van der Hoven, the most influential gossip in Newport, lean over to her husband at table 4. "Why is Reginald acting like a bouncer?" she whispered loud enough for half the room to hear. "That girl is stunning. Is that really the daughter they told us was unstable? She seems perfectly lovely to me." My mother Vivian heard it too. Her face went pale under her heavy foundation. She knew that in our social circle, reputation was currency, and Reginald was currently bankrupting us. She rushed forward, her heels clicking frantically on the marble. "Reginald, darling," she said, forcing a tight smile and placing a hand on his heaving chest. "Everyone is watching. Let her stay. We do not want a scene." Reginald looked around, realizing he had walked right into my trap. The Montgomery family was watching with judgmental eyes. If he threw me out now, he would look like a tyrant. He ground his teeth, his jaw muscle jumping visibly. "Fine!" He spat the word out like a curse. "You can stay." But if you make one wrong move, Maya, if you embarrass this family one more time, I will have you dragged out by your hair. I smiled, raising my glass in a mock toast. You are too kind, Father. I promise I will be on my best behavior. I watched him storm off toward the bar, needing a drink to calm his nerves. He thought he had won by granting me permission. He did not realize that I did not need his permission. I had already taken control of the room. I took another sip of champagne. It tasted like victory. But I knew this was just the opening skirmish. The real war was about to happen at the dinner table. I turned and walked toward the seating chart, ready for the next insult they had prepared for me. I scanned the oversized gold-embossed seating chart, searching for my name among the VIP guests. It was not at the head table with the family. It was not at the second-tier tables with the business partners. I finally found it scrawled at the very bottom of the list. Table 19. I turned and looked for the number. It was shoved into the darkest corner of the ballroom, directly next to the swinging kitchen doors and the bathrooms. It was the exile table. As I approached, I realized the insult was even more calculated than I expected. My dinner companions were not even distant relatives. They were 3 exhausted nannies in uniforms and 5 screaming toddlers who were currently throwing bread rolls at each other. This was Keisha attempting to scream to the world that I was nothing more than unpaid help in her eyes. I looked across the room and saw my sister watching me over the rim of her crystal goblet. Her eyes were gleaming with malicious anticipation. She was waiting for me to stomp my foot. She was waiting for me to demand a better seat so she could call me dramatic and cause a scene. She wanted to break my composure. I locked eyes with her and smiled a genuine, radiant smile that made her frown in confusion. I pulled out my chair and sat down next to Mrs. Higgins, the longtime nanny for our cousins, who looked mortified on my behalf. "Oh, honey," she whispered, patting my hand. "You do not have to sit here. I can ask them to bring another chair." I shook my head and poured myself a glass of water. "Do not be silly, Mrs. Higgins," I said loud enough for the table to hear. "This is the best seat in the house. The company here is far more honest than the people at the head table." I meant it. I would rather sit with crying babies than with the adults who were currently toasting to a fraudulent merger. I settled into my seat, ignoring the draft from the service door. I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. The screen glowed bright in the dim corner. It was time. I opened the encrypted messaging app I used to communicate with my board of directors. My thumb hovered over the send button. My father was currently laughing at the head table, clinking glasses with Brad, oblivious that his reign as CEO was measured in minutes. I typed out a single line of text: "Execute Phase 1, immediate acquisition of all outstanding debt." I pressed send. I watched the message status turn from sent to delivered, and then to read. I put the phone face down on the tablecloth and picked up a bread roll. Let them eat cake, I thought to myself, because by tomorrow morning they will be begging for crumbs. The takeover had officially begun, and from this corner table among the nannies and the noise, I was about to checkmate the king. Brad tapped the microphone, sending a high-pitched screech of feedback through the ballroom speakers before settling into his pose of self-importance. He smoothed his tuxedo jacket and beamed at the crowd, basking in the adoration of people who only liked him for his last name. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice booming with false modesty. "Today is not just about the union of 2 hearts, it is about the union of 2 empires." He gestured grandly toward my father, who was puffing out his chest like a proud rooster. "I am thrilled to announce that my investment firm will be acquiring Sterling Media in a deal valued at $50 million. The room erupted in polite applause. I sat back in my chair, swirling the ice in my water glass, watching the performance with the detached amusement of a predator watching a wounded gazelle limp in circles. Brad continued, gaining confidence with every nod of approval from the audience. He started throwing around financial buzzwords, clearly trying to impress the older bankers in the room. "We are looking at a complete vertical integration," he said, puffing himself up. By leveraging the company's current liabilities as liquid assets, we plan to triple our net equity within the first quarter purely through creative amortization. I froze. My glass stopped halfway to my mouth. Did he really just say that? He just claimed he was going to count debt as cash and use depreciation to create value. That was not just incorrect. It was impossible. It was the financial equivalent of saying he was going to bake a cake using only air and wishful thinking. A short, sharp laugh escaped my lips before I could stop it. It was a loud, involuntary snort of pure disbelief. In the quiet lull of his speech, it sounded like a gunshot. Brad stopped mid-sentence. His eyes snapped toward the corner table, searching for the source of the interruption. When he saw me covering my mouth with a napkin, his face twisted into a mask of pure loathing. He leaned into the microphone, his voice dripping with condescension. "Is something funny, Maya? Please do share. I am sure everyone would love to hear a secretary's perspective on high finance." The spotlight swung around, hitting me in the face, blinding me for a second. The entire room turned to look, waiting for the poor little sister to crumble. But I did not crumble. I did not. I lowered the napkin and looked him dead in the eye. "I am sorry, Brad," I said, my voice steady and clear. "I just thought it was hilarious that you think liabilities are assets. Unless you are planning to cook the books, that is illegal. But please do go on. Tell us more about this creative amortization." The silence that followed was deafening. I saw the blood drain from Brad's face. He knew that I knew. But his arrogance was too thick to let him back down. He gripped the podium until his knuckles turned white, hatred radiating off him in waves. He had just been humiliated by the beggar at the kids' table, and I knew in that moment he wanted to kill me. The war had just escalated from personal to professional, and he was unarmed. The applause for Brad's disastrous speech had barely faded when I sensed a shift in the air. The temperature at my table seemed to drop as a shadow fell over me. I did not need to look up to know who it was. The scent of Chanel No. 5 mixed with passive aggression was unmistakable. My mother Vivian stood looming over me, her manicured hand resting tightly on the back of my chair. To the rest of the room, she looked like a doting mother checking on her daughter. She even managed a fake benevolent smile for the nanny sitting across from me. But when she leaned down close to my ear, her whisper was like a hiss from a viper. "Are you proud of yourself, Maya? Do you feel big making your brother-in-law look stupid in front of our investors?" I slowly cut a piece of the dry chicken breast on my plate, refusing to look intimidated. "I did not make him look stupid, Mother. He did that all by himself when he tried to lie about amortization schedules to a room full of bankers. I simply corrected the math." Vivian's fingers dug into the upholstery of my chair. Her mask slipped just enough for me to see the pure venom underneath. "You have always been like this. Jealous. Bitter. You cannot stand that Keisha is happy. You cannot stand that she found a wealthy man who wants to take care of her while you are alone with your calculators and your empty apartment." That comment hit a nerve. Not because it was true, but because she wanted it to be true so badly. She needed me to be the miserable failure so she could feel better about her own life choices. I looked up at her, searching for a trace of the woman who used to braid my hair. I searched for the mother who used to call me her little genius. She was gone. In her place was a woman desperate to cling to status, even if it meant sacrificing her own child. "Listen to me, good Maya," she said, her voice dropping to a deadly octave. "You will finish your dinner quietly. You will smile for the pictures if asked. And then you will leave. Do not go to the after party. Do not talk to the guests. Just get in your car and go back to wherever you came from. We do not want your bad energy here. This is Keisha's night. Do not make me call security again." She patted my shoulder affectionately, for the audience straightened her pearl necklace and walked away without looking back. I watched her go, feeling a strange sensation in my chest. It was not pain, it was release. For years I had told myself that Mom was just a victim of Dad's bullying, that she would have protected me if she could. But in that moment the illusion shattered. She was not a victim, she was his accomplice. She chose the lie over the truth. She chose the golden child over the scapegoat. I put down my fork. The last thread of guilt holding me back just snapped. If she wanted me to leave, I would leave. But I was taking everything with me. The dessert course had barely been cleared when the master of ceremonies announced the presentation of gifts. This was the moment the Sterling family lived for. It was a public display of wealth where affection was measured in zeros. I watched as my cousins presented keys to a vintage Porsche and my aunt unveiled a set of silver from the 18th century. Keisha sat on her throne, feigning surprise with every box, while Brad calculated the resale value with his eyes. When the pile of luxury goods finally settled, the room turned to me. I stood up slowly, clutching a simple cream-colored envelope. I could feel the collective cringe of the room. A paper envelope usually meant a check, and everyone knew I supposedly had no money. I walked to the head table, the sound of my heels echoing in the silence. I extended the envelope to Keisha. She snatched it from my hand, her acrylic nails grazing my skin. "Let us see what the family charity case scraped together," she announced loud enough for the microphone to pick up. She tore the seal open with zero hesitation, expecting perhaps a savings bond or a gift card. Instead, she pulled out a single sheet of yellowed fragile paper. It was a charcoal sketch, rough and amateur but filled with emotion. It depicted two little girls holding hands under a large oak tree. Keisha stared at it for a second, her brow furrowed. Then she threw her head back and laughed, a harsh, cruel sound that grated on my nerves. "Are you serious, Maya? A drawing? You gave me a doodle for my wedding gift." She held it up for the room to see, mocking the uneven lines. "This is pathetic even for you. I thought you were cheap, but this is just insulting." With a look of pure disgust, she ripped the paper in half. Then in half again. She let the confetti of memories rain down onto the dirty floor. The room erupted in laughter. Brad chuckled, shaking his head at my apparent poverty. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I slowly knelt down in my red silk gown, ignoring the gasps of the guests. I picked up the pieces of paper with the reverence of a priest handling a holy relic. I placed them gently into my clutch. "That doodle," I said, my voice low and dangerous as I stood back up, was the last thing Nana Rose ever drew before she lost the use of her hands. It was of us, Keisha. The day she planted the oak tree in the backyard. The same tree you had cut down last week to make room for your tent. The laughter in the room died instantly. I looked my sister dead in the eye. "You just tore up the only thing in this entire room that had a soul. That piece of paper was worth more than your life because it was made with love. Something you will never understand." I turned my back on her stunned silence and walked away, leaving her sitting there surrounded by expensive gifts that suddenly looked very cheap. I pushed through the heavy oak door of the ladies' lounge, needing to wash the feeling of my sister's cruelty off my skin. The bathroom was an oasis of marble and gold leaf, quieter than the battlefield outside, but just as cold. I turned on the gold faucet, letting the freezing water run over my wrists. I stared at my reflection. The red lipstick remained perfect, but my eyes held a storm. I had just declared war, and the adrenaline was finally starting to fade, leaving behind a sharp clarity. Suddenly, the door swung open, and a cloud of expensive perfume filled the air. Two of Keisha's bridesmaids stumbled in, giggling and clutching their champagne flutes. I recognized them immediately. Chloe and Jasmine. They were the type of women who would sell their own grandmothers for a verified checkmark on social media. I instinctively stepped back into the shadows of the towel alcove, drying my hands. They did not see me. They were too busy checking their makeup in the expansive mirror and dissecting the disaster they had just witnessed. Can you believe that drawing Chloe shrieked, applying a fresh coat of gloss? I almost died of secondhand embarrassment. Keisha was savage for tearing it up, though. Jasmine laughed, leaning against the marble counter. "Honestly, she is stressed. You know the rumor, right? The Sterlings are completely broke. My dad told me Reginald has been borrowing money all over town just to pay for this wedding. If Keisha does not lock down Brad and his family money tonight, they are going to lose everything." I stood frozen in the alcove. So it was not just bad business. It was total insolvency. My suspicions were confirmed. My parents were selling Keisha to Brad like livestock to save their own skins. But the conversation took a turn I did not expect. Jasmine lowered her voice, dropping the bubbly facade. Well, she better hope Brad actually likes her. Because I saw him texting his ex-girlfriend Jessica all through the ceremony. He told the groomsmen at the bachelor party that he is only marrying Keisha for the access to Reginald's media connections. He called her a necessary evil. Chloe gasped, but then shrugged. Whatever. A rich husband who cheats is still a rich husband. At least she will cry in a Bentley. They both burst into cruel laughter, unaware that the woman they were mocking was about to lose the Bentley and the husband. My blood ran cold. The irony was suffocating. My parents were pushing Keisha into a marriage to save them from bankruptcy. But Brad was only marrying Keisha because he thought my father could save him from his own legal troubles. It was two drowning people grabbing onto each other thinking the other one was a life raft. And Keisha, the golden child, was just collateral damage. A pawn in a game where everyone was cheating. I stepped out of the alcove, my red dress reflecting in the mirror behind them. The laughter died in their throats as they saw me in the reflection. I did not say a word. I simply crumpled the paper towel, threw it into the gold bin, and walked out. I had all the ammunition I needed. Brad was not just a fraud, he was a predator. And I was about to become the hunter. The hallway leading to the library was lined with portraits of my ancestors. Stern-faced men who had built the Sterling legacy from the ground up using grit and steel. They stared down at me as I walked past, their eyes seeming to judge the red dress and the rebellion it represented. I was looking for my father. Part of me, the foolish child inside, wanted to give him one last chance. I wanted to look him in the eye and ask if selling his company was really worth losing his dignity. But as I approached the heavy mahogany doors of the library, I heard voices. They were not the celebratory tones of a wedding party. They were raised, sharp, and laced with panic. I slowed my pace, my heels sinking silently into the plush Persian runner. The door was cracked open just an inch, spilling a sliver of yellow light into the dark hall. I pressed my back against the wall, holding my breath, and listened. "You cannot push me like this, Brad." My father's voice sounded small, smaller than I had ever heard it. "The papers are not ready. The legal team said we need another week to finalize the valuation of the assets. We can sign the preliminary agreement tonight, but the full transfer has to wait." There was a sound of glass shattering against the fireplace. I flinched, but did not move. Brad's voice followed, cold and terrifyingly calm. "I do not have a week, Reginald. I do not have a day. I need that signature on the transfer deed tonight, before the clock strikes 12. "But why?" my father pleaded. "Why the rush? The wedding hasn't even happened yet." "Because my liquidity is tied up," Brad lied, but I could hear the tremor of desperation in his arrogance. "It is a time-sensitive opportunity in Dubai. If I do not move the capital now, the deal falls through." "You are lying." My father actually found a backbone for a second. "I made some calls, Brad. I know about the trips to Macau. I know about the private games in Connecticut. You are not investing in Dubai. You are drowning. You need my company's assets to pay off your gambling debts before these people come for your knees." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. I slowly pulled my phone from my clutch. My heart was hammering against my ribs, not from fear, but from adrenaline. I opened the voice memo app and hit record. "So what if I am?" Brad's voice dropped low, dangerously close to a whisper. "You think you have a choice here, old man. You are broke. Your company is hemorrhaging money. The only reason the banks haven't foreclosed on this house yet is because they think you are merging with the Montgomery family. If I walk out that door right now, if I call off this wedding, you are finished. Your reputation is dead. You will be the laughingstock of Newport. So you are going to pick up that pen, and you are going to sign over your life's work to cover my losses, and you are going to do it with a smile. because the alternative is admitting to the world that you failed. I watched through this crack in the door as my father, the man who terrified me, my whole childhood, slumped into his leather chair. He looked defeated. He looked pathetic. He reached for the gold fountain pen, his hand shaking violently. The great Reginald Sterling was being blackmailed by a boy half his age. I had heard enough. I stopped the recording and saved the file. The file name was simply Checkmate. I had the gun. Now I just needed to pull the trigger. I watched as my father wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, his hand hovering over the document that Brad had slammed onto the mahogany desk. The tension in the room was so thick, it felt like a physical weight pressing against the door. Reginald was crumbling right before my eyes, stripping away every layer of integrity he claimed to possess. But Brad was not done yet. He leaned over the desk, placing both hands flat on the leather surface, and delivered the final fatal blow. "The real estate assets are not enough, Reginald," he said, his voice cold and devoid of humanity. "The market is down. If we want to cover the full debt and have enough left over for my Dubai buy-in, we need more liquid cash. We need the employee pension fund." I gasped silently, covering my mouth with my hand. The pension fund. That money belonged to people like Mrs. Gable, the receptionist, who had worked for Sterling Media for 30 years. It belonged to the janitors, the mid-level managers, the people who built this company while my father played golf. Stealing it was not just business malpractice, it was a federal crime. Surely even Reginald Sterling had limits. Surely he would draw the line at robbing his most loyal servants. "You cannot be serious," my father whispered, his face losing the last of its color. "That is $5 million of retirement savings. If the SEC finds out I raided the pension fund to pay off a personal merger debt, I will go to prison. I will lose everything." "Lose? You will only go to prison if you get caught," Brad replied with a dismissive shrug, straightening his tuxedo jacket. "And you won't get caught because once the merger is complete, my accountants will restructure the debt as a failed investment loss. The employees will get pennies on the dollar, but who cares? They are nobodies. You are a Sterling. Do you want to save Mrs. Gable's retirement? Or do you want to save your own reputation? Sign the paper, Reginald." I saw the light go out in my father's eyes. The last flicker of conscience was extinguished by his own cowardice. He looked down at the paper, thinking only of his country club membership and his mansion. He gripped the gold pen tighter. "God forgive me," he muttered. Then he pressed the nib to the paper and signed his name. The scratching sound of the pen on the document echoed in the silent library like a shovel hitting a coffin. He had just sold his soul and the livelihood of 200 employees to a con artist. I slowly raised my left wrist. I had been recording on my phone, but I needed a backup. I tapped the face of my smartwatch, activating the high-fidelity audio recorder. The tiny red pixel pulsed silently on the screen, capturing every word of their conspiracy. I had them. I had the blackmail. I had the confession. And now I had the proof of embezzlement. The anger that had been fueling me all night shifted into something colder and more calculated. This was no longer just about getting revenge for my own childhood. This was a rescue mission. I was going to destroy them not just for me, but for Mrs. Gable and every other employee they planned to betray. I lowered my wrist, my heart beating in a steady rhythmic drum of war. I slipped away from the door just as Brad poured 2 glasses of scotch to toast their crime. "Drink up, boys," I thought as I retreated down the hall, "because that is the last drink you will ever enjoy as free men." I turned on my heel, intending to storm back to the ballroom, but a heavy hand slammed against the wall inches from my face, blocking my path. I stopped instantly, my heart rate spiking, not from fear, but from a sudden surge of adrenaline. It was Brad. He had slipped out of the library side door and circled back, hoping to catch me. He stood too close, invading my personal space with the stench of expensive scotch and cheap cologne. His eyes raked over my body, lingering on the neckline of my red dress with a look that made my skin crawl. It was a look of possession. He did not see a sister-in-law. He saw an object he hadn't conquered yet. "Leaving so soon, Maya?" he purred, leaning in until I could feel his hot breath on my neck. You know, for a charity case, you clean up surprisingly well. Maybe I was too hasty. I'm going to be a very powerful man by midnight. If you beg nicely, I might find a position for you. I could always use a private secretary who knows how to keep her mouth shut. The implication was disgusting. He was marrying my sister in less than an hour yet. Here he was cornering me in a dark hallway, trying to leverage his stolen power into a sexual favor. He raised his hand, reaching out to stroke my cheek, his arrogance blinding him to the danger he was in. He thought I was prey. He forgot that even a cornered cat has claws. The moment his fingertips brushed my skin, I moved. It was a reflex born from years of self-defense classes I took while living alone in the city. I grabbed his wrist with my left hand and seized his index finger with my right. With a sharp, calculated motion, I bent the finger back toward his forearm until I felt the resistance of the joint. Brad let out a strangled yelp, his knees buckling as the pain shot up his arm. I did not let go. I twisted harder, forcing him down until his face was level with mine. The lust in his eyes vanished, replaced by shock and agony. "Listen to me remarkably well, Brad," I whispered, my voice ice cold. "Do not ever touch me again, and certainly do not touch me with hands that are about to be in handcuffs." I released him with a shove, sending him stumbling back against the opposite wall. He clutched his hands, staring at me as if I had just sprouted horns. I straightened my dress, looking down at him with pure pity. "You are not a powerful man, Brad. You are a criminal with a ticking clock. I suggest you go enjoy your champagne. It is the last luxury you will taste for a very long time." I walked past him, leaving him gasping in the hallway, nursing his bruised ego and his throbbing hand. He had no idea that the physical pain was the least of his worries. The real blow was coming, and it would hurt much more than a bent finger. I emerged from the hallway darkness, back into the golden glow of the ballroom, leaving a whimpering Brad behind me. My heart was pounding, not from the physical altercation, but from the sheer weight of what I was about to do. I looked toward the head table. My father, Reginald, was standing there holding a crystal flute of champagne, looking like the king of the world. He was laughing with a group of investors, completely unaware that he had just signed his own death warrant in the library. I took a deep breath. I had the recording. I had the evidence. But a tiny foolish part of me, the part that still remembered him teaching me to ride a bike, wanted to give him one final lifeline. I needed to know for sure that there was no redemption left in him. I marched straight to the center of the dance floor, my red dress blazing like a warning signal. "Father," I called out, my voice projecting clearly over the low murmur of conversation. "Stop the music." The band leader hesitated, looking from me to my father, but the authority in my voice made him lower his baton. The room fell into an uneasy silence once again. Reginald lowered his glass, his face darkening with instant fury. He stepped down from the dais, marching toward me with heavy, aggressive steps. "I told you to sit down and shut up, Maya," he growled, his voice low and threatening. "Why are you determined to ruin this night? Is your jealousy really that deep?" I did not back down. I stood my ground, looking him dead in the eye. "It is not jealousy, father, it is facts. I am warning you one last time. Do not file those merger papers. Check Brad's financials. Check the SEC filings. He is not investing in you. He is using Sterling Media to launder money because he is bankrupt." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. For a second, I saw a flicker of doubt in my father's eyes. But then he looked at the crowd. He looked at the wealthy guests watching him, judging him, waiting to see if he had control over his own house. His pride won out over his reason. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He did not speak. He moved. His hand lashed out with a speed I did not expect. The sound of the slap was like a gunshot in the silent room. My head snapped to the side, the force of the blow stinging my cheek and bringing tears to my eyes. The entire ballroom gasped in unison. A few people stood up in shock. My father stood over me, chest heaving, his hand still raised. "Shut your mouth," he screamed, spitting the words at me. "You are a liar. You are a poisonous, jealous little brat who cannot stand to see her sister succeed. Brad is a visionary. You are nothing. You are a beggar I allowed in here out of pity. Now get out, before I have you thrown out." I slowly turned my face back to look at him. My cheek was throbbing, burning with heat, but my eyes were dry. I tasted blood on my lip. I looked at the man who gave me life and realized he was dead to me. The slap had broken the last chain of obligation. He wanted a beggar. He wanted a villain. Fine. I would give him exactly what he asked for. I touched my cheek, feeling the heat radiating from his palm print. I stared at him with a cold, absolute finality. I nodded once. Nodded. "Understood, father," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but echoing with terrifying calm. "You made your choice. Now watch me make mine." The echo of the slap seemed to hang in the air long after the sound faded. My cheek burned with a fierce heat, a physical manifestation of the bridge my father had just incinerated. The crowd held its collective breath, hundreds of eyes darting between Reginald's heaving chest and my reddening face. They expected tears. They expected the fragile, broken daughter to run weeping toward the exit, humiliated once again by the great patriarch. Keisha was already smirking behind her hand, ready to bid me good riddance. But I did not cry. I did not run. I slowly raised my hand to my face, tracing the outline of the abuse. The stinging pain was clarifying. It washed away the last lingering hesitation I had about destroying them. I looked at Reginald, seeing him not as a father, but as a liability. "You should have saved that energy, father," I said, my voice barely a whisper yet, carrying the weight of a judge's gavel. "You are going to need it when the police arrive." I turned my back on him, dismissing him completely. I looked up toward the DJ booth on the balcony. Marcus, the DJ, was watching me intently. He was not just hired help. He was a computer science student whose entire tuition I had quietly paid off earlier that evening via a secure transfer. He was loyal to the checkbook, not the venue. He knew the signal. I locked eyes with him and gave a single slow nod. It was a small movement, but it carried the force of an execution order. Marcus killed the faders instantly. The festive jazz music cut out as if someone had severed the power cord with an axe. The sudden silence was violent. It was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar in the void. The guests froze, glasses halfway to their mouths. The ambient chatter died out as people realized the atmosphere had shifted from awkward family drama to something far more dangerous. The party was over. The trial was about to begin. I walked toward the main microphone stand that Brad had abandoned earlier. The click of my heels on the marble floor sounded like a countdown ticking towards 0. I gripped the cold metal of the stand and looked out at the sea of confused faces. I saw my mother clutching her pearls, her eyes wide with panic. I saw Brad nursing his broken finger, sweating profusely. I saw the fear starting to dawn in their eyes. They realized too late that the slap was not the end of the show. It was the opening bell. And they were trapped in the ring with a heavyweight. The massive LED screen behind the head table, which was scheduled to play a sentimental montage of Keisha and Brad's relationship set to a generic love song, suddenly flickered violently. The image of the happy couple walking on a beach distorted into static before the screen went completely black. A low hum of confusion rippled through the guests. My father turned around, signaling frantically to the audiovisual team, assuming it was a technical glitch. But then the screen blazed back to life with blinding clarity. It was not a photo. It was a document. A bank statement, to be precise. The logo of the Cayman Islands Sovereign Bank was stamped in the top corner, followed by the account holder name, Bradley J. Montgomery. The text was large enough for people in the back row to read without glasses. But it was the number at the bottom of the page that sucked the oxygen out of the room. It was printed in bold, aggressive red ink. $21,450,000. The collective gasp that tore through the ballroom was louder than the music had been. People stood up, craning their necks to make sure they were seeing correctly. The whispers started instantly spreading like a wildfire in dry grass. Is that real? Is he bankrupt? I thought he was worth hundreds of millions. I leaned into the microphone, my voice calm and authoritative, cutting through the chaos like a knife. You asked for the truth, Father. Here it is. You are looking at the current liquidity of your future son-in-law, or rather, the lack thereof. Brad is not a venture capitalist. He is a gambler who has leveraged every asset he has ever touched, including his grandmother's estate, which was foreclosed on last Tuesday. Brad lunged toward the stage, his face a mask of sheer panic. Turn it off! He screamed, his voice cracking. It is a fake! She photoshopped it. Do not look at it. He waved his arms, trying to physically block the 60-foot screen, with his body looking small and pathetic against the glowing evidence of his failure. But the screen changed again. This time it showed a series of wire transfers. $1 million to a shell company in Panama. $2 million to a known gambling syndicate in Macau. The dates coincided perfectly with the times he claimed to be away on business trips. I continued my narration, ignoring his screaming. As you can see, Brad has been hemorrhaging money for 3 years. He did not propose to Keisha because he loves her. He proposed because he needed access to the Sterling Family Trust to pay off the loan sharks who are currently tracking his location. He is not here to marry into the family. He is here to loot it. Keisha stood frozen at the head table, her face pale as a ghost. She looked from the screen to Brad, waiting for him to explain, waiting for him to laugh and say it was a cruel prank. But Brad wasn't laughing. He was sweating, shaking, and looking for the nearest exit. The golden boy had just been stripped naked in front of the very people he tried to con. The illusion of wealth shattered, leaving behind only the ugly truth of a desperate criminal. The ballroom erupted into chaos, but it was not the loud, raucous kind, rather the horrified murmuring of the elite witnessing a train wreck. Waiters stopped serving, and the string quartet looked terrified, clutching their instruments like shields. Brad was jumping up and down, waving his arms like a maniac, trying to cover the massive LED screen with his body, as if he could block the truth with his tuxedo jacket. It is a glitch, he screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched squeal that echoed painfully through the room. Somebody hacked the system. Get security. Turn it off right now. He pointed a trembling finger at the projectionist booth, but the technician who was on my payroll simply crossed his arms and did nothing. The numbers remained on the screen, glowing red, like a neon sign of his incompetence, casting a demonic light over Brad's sweating face. I saw Mr. Montgomery, Brad's father, stand up from table 1. He looked pale. He knew exactly what those wire transfers meant. Federal prison. He did not rush to help his son. Instead, he started backing away toward the emergency exit, abandoning his flesh and blood to the wolves. That was the thing about these people. Loyalty lasted only as long as the bank account. My father, Reginald, stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. He looked from the screen to Brad and then to me, realizing with dawning horror that he had bet his entire company on a horse that was already dead. I walked toward the stage. The crowd parted for me instinctively, moving aside as if I were carrying a contagious disease or a loaded weapon. They sensed the shift in power. I was no longer the beggar at the kids' table. I was the executioner. I climbed the stairs, my red dress trailing behind me like royal robes. Brad turned to face me, his eyes wide with terror. He tried to grab the microphone stand, but I was faster. I gripped the cold metal and looked down at him. Get away from me, he hissed, lunging for the mic, desperate to silence me. You ruined everything, you jealous witch. I simply stepped back, letting him trip over a speaker cable in his haste. He fell hard onto the stage, landing at my feet with a heavy thud. The symbolism was perfect. He was on his knees right where he belonged. I lifted the microphone from its stand. The feedback whine silenced the room one last time. I looked out at the sea of faces, at my parents cowering in the front row, and at my sister weeping into her napkin. Please forgive the interruption, ladies and gentlemen, I said, my voice smooth and amplified, filling every corner of the estate. But I believe there has been a terrible misunderstanding about who actually paid for this party, and more importantly, who actually owns the building we are standing in. I stood tall on the stage looking down at the terrified faces of my family. The silence in the ballroom was absolute, broken only by the sharp feedback of the microphone as I adjusted the stand. For years you have all known me as Maya the Disappointment. You whispered behind your hands that I was the black sheep, the unemployed artist who could not pay her own rent. You watched my father treat me like a servant and you said nothing because you believed I deserved it. You thought I was a beggar because I never flashed my money. But in the world of high finance, silence is not weakness. Silence is strategy. I gestured toward the massive screen behind me. The humiliating image of Brad's bank account faded, replaced by a sleek, formidable corporate logo. A gold M and a gold S, intertwined against a black background. Below it was a series of complex legal documents, scanned in high definition. They were debt acquisition forms, commercial mortgage deeds, and lien transfers. I am not unemployed, I said, my voice steady and commanding. I am the founder and majority shareholder of MS Holdings, the very venture capital firm that my father has been trying to contact for the last 6 months. The gasps from the audience were audible. My father, Reginald, took a stumbling step forward, his face draining of all color. He knew that name. He had sent emails to MS Holdings begging for a bailout. He had sent gift baskets. He had left desperate voicemails for a CEO he had never met. He stared at the screen, and then at me, his brain struggling to connect the dots. Yes, father, I continued, answering the question in his eyes. MS stands for Maya Sterling. You told everyone I was useless while I was building an empire. You thought you were negotiating with a faceless corporation in New York. In reality, you were negotiating with the daughter you just slapped. I pointed to the document on the screen. This is the deed to the Vanderbilt estate. My firm purchased the commercial lease on this property 3 days ago. And this document next to it is the promissory note for Sterling Media's operating line of credit. I own your company's debt. I own your mortgage. And technically speaking, since I paid the catering deposit this morning to stop the chef from walking out, I own the food on your plates. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a stack of business cards made of heavy black metal with gold engraving. I tossed them into the air, letting them rain down on Brad, who was still cowering at my feet. Pick one up, Brad, I said, cold and merciless. You might need a lawyer. My legal team is the best in the city, but unfortunately for you, they are busy prosecuting you. The realization hit the room like a physical wave. The beggar was not just a queen, she was the landlord. And eviction time had just arrived. My father stood frozen at the foot of the stage, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. The great Reginald Sterling, the man who terrified boardrooms and bullied his family, was suddenly reduced to a trembling old man. You, he stammered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the air conditioning. You are the investor. You are the one holding the notes. It was not a question. It was a realization of horror. He turned to look at the screen where the documents were displayed, then back to me. His brain was trying to reconcile the image of his disappointment daughter with the financial shark who now owned his life. I watched the color drain from his face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. Yes, father, I said, my voice echoing through the silent ballroom. You spent the last 6 months sending emails to my office. You sent gift baskets. You left desperate voicemails begging for a meeting with the CEO of MS Holdings. You offered to fly to New York. You offered to name a building after the investor. You did everything except check who actually signed the checks. I paused, letting the humiliation sink in. I bought your debt 6 months ago. The bank was ready to foreclose on the media tower and this estate. They were going to auction off your furniture. I stepped in and bought the portfolio for pennies on the dollar. Not because I wanted to save you, but because I wanted to be the one standing here when the clock ran out. Reginald grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself. His knees gave way, and he collapsed into the seat looking small and defeated. He realized that every meal he ate, every glass of wine he drank, and every night he slept in this mansion for the last half-year was on my dime. He had been living on the charity of the daughter he called a beggar. The irony was suffocating him. You knew, he whispered, looking up at me with watery eyes. You sat there at Christmas dinner while I bragged about the mysterious new investor and you said nothing. That is right, father, I replied, cold and unyielding. I listened to you call me a failure while I was secretly paying your light bill. I listened to you praise Keisha while I was the one keeping the roof over your head. I wanted to see how far you would go. I wanted to see if you would ever treat me with respect without knowing I had money. And tonight you gave me your answer. You do not respect people. You only respect power. Well, look at me, father. I have the power now. And you have absolutely nothing. I held up my phone, the screen glowing like a beacon of truth in the dim ballroom. Brad was scrambling to his feet, his face a mask of desperate panic. Do not listen to her, he shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. She is using AI. That is a deep fake. She is trying to frame me. I did not dignify his lies with a response. I simply plugged the auxiliary cable from the podium into my device. The connection hummed for a second before I pressed play. The sound quality was crystal clear, capturing every nuance of the conversation I had recorded in the library less than an hour ago. Brad's voice, arrogant and slurring slightly from the scotch, boomed through the speakers with terrifying clarity. I am not investing in this family, Reginald. I am harvesting it. The recording continued, causing the guests to gasp in unison. Keisha is just the entry fee. God, she is so desperate it is pathetic. All I have to do is buy her something shiny, and she stops asking questions. Once I get access to the joint accounts after the wedding, I am transferring the liquid assets to my offshore accounts and disappearing to Dubai. By the time that dim-witted cow realizes I am gone, I will be untouchable. I just have to tolerate her annoying voice for a few more weeks. The recording ended with the sound of Brad laughing and the clink of ice in a glass. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bones. Every person in the room turned to look at the bride. Keisha stood at the head table looking like a statue made of ash. Her hands were trembling so violently that her champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering on the floor, but she did not seem to notice. The man she thought was her Prince Charming had just called her a cow and a mark in front of everyone she knew. The illusion of her perfect life dissolved instantly. Her knees buckled. She did not faint gracefully like they do in movies. She crumbled, collapsing into a pile of white lace and misery, hitting the floor with a heavy thud that made my mother scream. Brad stood frozen on stage, his face pale as death. There was no denying it. That was his voice. Those were his words. The guests looked at him with pure revulsion. I looked down at him, my expression unreadable. You called her stupid, Brad. I said, my voice amplified and cold. But the only stupid person here is you. You thought you were stealing from a helpless family. You did not realize you were stealing from me. And I do not let anyone touch what is mine. Not even the scraps. The silence that followed the recording was shattered by a sound that made the blood drain from my father's face. It started as a distant wail, but within seconds, it grew into a deafening cacophony of sirens surrounding the estate. Blue and red strobe lights began to flash through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the horrified guests in alternating shades of bruise-colored light. The panic in the room shifted from social embarrassment to legal terror. Brad looked toward the emergency exit behind the stage, his eyes darting like a trapped rat, but it was too late. The heavy oak doors at the main entrance flew open with a force that rattled the crystal chandeliers. Federal agents. Nobody move. The command boomed across the ballroom. A team of agents in windbreakers emblazoned with the letters FBI stormed into the room, moving with military precision. They did not look at the guests. They did not look at the decorations. They had only one target. They moved in a wedge formation straight toward the stage where Brad was still standing near the microphone, his face a mask of absolute disbelief. My father turned to me, his hands shaking violently. What is happening, Maya? Did you call the police? I looked at him with a calm, detached expression. I did not call the police, father. I said, my voice steady. I called the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I did not do it just now. I sent them a complete dossier of Brad's offshore accounts and his fraudulent tax returns at 9 o'clock this morning. They have been parked down the street waiting for him to publicly admit to the merger, so they could add securities fraud to the list of charges. You just watched a sting operation and you were the bait. Brad tried to scramble backward, but two agents were on him instantly. One grabbed his left arm, twisting it behind his back with practiced efficiency, while the other kicked his legs apart. Bradley Montgomery, you are under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement. The agent read him his rights as the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The sound was crisp and final, echoing through the silent room. Brad screamed in pain and humiliation, his tuxedo jacket bunching up as he was shoved face first against a speaker. I will sue you. Do you know who my father is? He yelled, but his threats sounded hollow against the reality of federal charges. I walked to the edge of the stage, looking down at him. Your father is currently running out the back door, Brad, I said, pointing toward the exit where Mr. Montgomery was indeed trying to slip away unnoticed. Nobody is coming to save you. You spent years destroying people's lives with a pen and a spreadsheet. Now you get to see how the other half lives. I hope you like orange jumpsuits because that tuxedo is the last piece of designer clothing you will wear for 20 years. The agents hauled him up and began dragging him through the center of the ballroom, past the people he had tried to impress, past the fiancée he had planned to rob, and past the father-in-law he had blackmailed. The party was officially a crime scene. The sight of a groom being dragged away in handcuffs is something usually reserved for bad reality television. But tonight, it was happening in high definition, right here in the Sterling Ballroom. Two agents gripped Brad's arms, hoisting him off his feet, as he kicked and thrashed like a toddler having a tantrum. His polished patent leather shoes scuffed against the marble floor, leaving black streaks that mirrored the stain he had left on this family. His bow tie was crooked, hanging loosely around his neck, and his expensive hair gel was melting under the heat of his panic. He was no longer the smug financial wizard who had mocked my dress earlier. He was a cornered animal realizing the trap had snapped shut. As they dragged him past the stage, he locked eyes with me. His face was a contorted map of pure hatred, veins bulging in his neck. You think you won, he screamed, spitting saliva that flew into the light of the strobes. You are nothing, Maya. You are a bitter, lonely witch. I will get out on bail tomorrow and I will come for you. I will burn your company to the ground. You hear me? I will destroy you. The agents tightened their grip, forcing a grunt of pain from his lips, but he kept screaming, throwing every slur and curse he could think of in my direction. He called me every name in the book, trying to use his voice to regain the power he had just lost. But his words had no weight. They were just noise. The desperate barking of a dog behind a fence. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply watched him being hauled toward the double doors, the flashing police lights framing his exit like a spotlight on a tragedy. A waiter stood nearby holding a tray of drinks, his hands shaking so hard the glasses were clinking together. I reached out and calmly took a glass of red wine from the tray. The liquid was dark and rich, swirling in the crystal as I raised it to the light. It was the Chateau Margaux 1982, the vintage I had saved from being ruined earlier in the kitchen. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the complex flavors of blackcurrant and cedar coat my tongue. It was perfect, smooth-aged, and expensive. I lowered the glass and looked at Brad, who was now being shoved into the back of a black government SUV outside the main doors. That is a shame, I said loud enough for the nearby guests to hear my voice cutting through the lingering tension. This is an exquisite vintage, full-bodied with a very long finish. Just like your sentence is going to be. It is a pity you will not get to taste it, Brad. Prison wine is notoriously acidic. I toasted the empty doorway where he had just vanished, taking another sip as the heavy doors swung shut, sealing his fate. The room remained silent, staring at me with a mixture of terror and awe. I had not just defeated the villain, I had done it without spilling a single drop. The blue and red lights of the police convoy faded into the distance, but the atmosphere in the ballroom remained electric. The guests were paralyzed, unsure whether to flee or stay for the finale of this family collapse. My mother, Vivian, who had been standing over Keisha in stunned silence, suddenly snapped. The reality that her social standing was disintegrating triggered a primal defensive rage. She stepped over her weeping daughter and marched toward the stage, her heels striking the floor with aggressive fury. She looked like a cornered animal fighting for its territory. "You vicious, ungrateful snake!" she screamed, her voice shrill enough to shatter glass. "You think you have won because you called the feds on Brad? You think you are smart because you bought some company debt? But you forget one thing, Maya." She stopped inches from the stage, looking up at me with eyes full of venom. "This is still my house. I am the mistress of the Vanderbilt estate. I have lived here for 30 years. I chose these drapes. I hosted the governor's ball in this room. You are nothing but a guest. A rude, unwanted guest. Now get out of my property before I have you arrested for trespassing." Reginald seemed to find a shred of courage in his wife's outburst. He stood up, straightening his tie. "She is right, Maya. The deed is in my name. You might own the corporate loans, but you cannot touch my personal residence. You have no legal standing here. Get out." I looked at them both with a mixture of pity and amusement. They were clinging to the wreckage of a ship that had already sunk. I handed my wineglass to a stunned waiter and reached into my clutch one last time. I did not pull out a phone or a bank statement. I pulled out a thick document bound in heavy blue legal paper. It looked old. The edges were slightly yellowed, and it carried a faint scent of lavender. The scent of Nana Rose. "Actually, Mother," I said, opening the document with a sharp snap that echoed in the silence. "You are wrong. You have been living here for 30 years, but you have been a squatter for the last 10. I turned the document around so the front row could see the signature at the bottom. It was bold, elegant, and unmistakably my grandmother's. "This is Nana Rose's last will and testament. The original copy, not the fraudulent version Father filed with the probate court after she died." Reginald's face went from gray to a sickly, translucent white. He recognized the document immediately. He thought he had destroyed the only copy years ago. He started to shake his hand, gripping the back of his chair for support. "Nana Rose knew you were stealing from her," I continued, my voice hard as granite. "She knew you bullied me. She knew you were weak and greedy, so she bypassed you entirely." I read from the text, my voice projecting to the back of the room. Clause 4, Section 1. I grant the Vanderbilt estate and all its contents in their entirety to my eldest granddaughter, Maya Sterling. I turned 25 last week, which means the trust has officially dissolved and the title has transferred. My lawyer filed the paperwork this morning while you were getting your hair done. This house is not yours, Father. It never was. It is mine, and I have a zero-tolerance policy for liars and thieves. You have exactly 1 hour to pack your bags and leave my property. The blue legal paper crackled as I folded it back into its pristine shape, placing it gently onto the podium next to the microphone. The sound was sharp and final, like a gavel striking a block. My mother, Vivian, was vibrating with a frequency of rage I had never seen before. Her face was contorted, destroying the work of her expensive plastic surgeons as she lunged toward me. Her hands were clawed, reaching for the will as if tearing it up would somehow rewrite the laws of inheritance. But she never reached me. I snapped my fingers. It was a crisp, clear sound that cut through the hysteria. From the shadows of the ballroom periphery, 6 men emerged. They were not the elderly rent-a-cops the event planner had hired to check invitations. These were men I had brought with me. They wore charcoal suits that cost more than my father's car, and they moved with the silent, terrifying efficiency of private military contractors. They formed a wall between the stage and my family, their expressions hidden behind dark sunglasses despite the indoor lighting. They were the security detail for MS Holdings, and they answered only to me. I leaned into the microphone one last time, my voice echoing with the absolute authority of ownership. "I seem to recall a specific rule you taught me, Father. I believe it was during my 16th birthday when you threw my friends out because they were not from the right neighborhood. You said that a man's home is his castle, and he has the right to remove any unwanted refuse." I looked down at him where he stood trembling by the salad station. I am exercising that right. Security, please remove these trespassers from my property. Immediately. Reginald sputtered, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. You cannot be serious, Maya. We are your parents. You cannot kick us out of our own home in the middle of the night. We have nowhere to go. All our assets are frozen. That sounds like a personal problem, I replied, cold and unmoving. Maybe you can stay with friends. Oh, wait. I looked out at the guests who were currently averting their eyes, pretending to study the floral arrangements to avoid association with the sinking ship. It seems your friends are not interested in harboring fugitives. Vivian let out a shriek that sounded more animal than human. My clothes, my jewelry. I have vintage furs in the vault. I am not leaving without my things. She tried to push past the lead security officer, a man named Corbin, who was built like a tank. He simply held out a hand, stopping her momentum without even flinching. I shook my head. You are confused, Mother. Those are not your things. The will states clearly that I inherit the estate and its contents. That includes the furniture, the art, the jewelry in the safe, and yes, even the vintage furs. You bought them with money stripped from Nana Rose's account so legally they were never yours to begin with. You leave with what you are wearing. And considering that dress was purchased on a company credit card that I now own, you are lucky I am not making you leave naked. The room went dead silent. The brutality of the statement hung in the air. It was cruel. It was vicious. And it was exactly the kind of lesson they needed. I nodded to Corbin. Escort them out. If they resist, call the local sheriff and have them charged with criminal trespassing and disturbance of the peace. Corbin moved. He grabbed Reginald by the elbow. It was not a gentle guide. It was a firm iron grip that said compliance is mandatory. My father, the man who had strutted through this house like a king for decades, was marched toward the exit like a common drunk being tossed from a bar. Vivian followed, screaming obscenities, flailing her arms, trying to grab onto a table to anchor herself. One of the other guards unpeeled her fingers from the tablecloth, sending a centerpiece crashing to the floor. Then there was Keisha. She was still on the floor, surrounded by the wreckage of her wedding dress and her life. She looked up at me, mascara running down her face in black rivers. Maya, she whispered, her voice broken. Please. I didn't know. I am your sister. I looked down at her. I felt a flicker of pity, but I crushed it instantly, remembering the drawing she tore up. Remember the ridicule. Remember the years of silence when I needed help. You are not my sister, Keisha, I said, my voice devoid of warmth. You are just another employee of a bankrupt company. And you are fired. Get up and get out. She sobbed, heaving herself up, her heavy lace dress dragging behind her like a shroud. She stumbled after our parents, flanked by guards who looked at her with zero sympathy. I watched them go. I watched the three people who had defined my world with pain and rejection be physically pushed through the heavy double doors. The guards stepped outside with them and pulled the doors shut. The heavy boom of the latch engaging echoed through the cavernous room. They were gone. The silence that rushed back into the space was not empty. It was heavy. It was rich. It was the feeling of total, absolute victory. I turned my attention to the remaining guests. The room was full of Newport's elite, standing in awkward silence, terrified that they might be next. I smiled, a genuine, dazzling smile. Please do not let this little family squabble ruin your evening. The criminals have been removed. The champagne is paid for and the band has been prepaid for another 2 hours. I raised my glass high. Eat, drink, and be merry. But do remember one thing. When you do business in this town from now on, you answer to me. Enjoy the party. I turned on my heel and walked off the stage, my red dress flowing behind me, leaving a room full of stunned millionaires to contemplate the new world order. I walked out of the ballroom and into the cool, high-ceilinged foyer of the estate. The heavy oak doors muffled the sounds of the party dying a slow, awkward death behind me. My heels clicked rhythmically on the black and white marble tiles, a sound of victory that I wanted to savor in silence. But silence was apparently too much to ask for tonight. The sound of frantic, heavy footsteps slapping against the stone shattered my peace. It was the desperate, uncoordinated run of someone unaccustomed to moving without a safety net. Maya, wait. Please wait. I stopped, but I did not turn around. I knew that voice. It was usually high-pitched and demanding, used to ordering lattes or complaining about the thread count of her sheets. Now it was ragged, wet with tears and trembling with fear. I felt a hand grab my arm. Her grip was slippery with sweat and desperation. I looked down at the hand. The manicure was perfect, but the fingers were shaking. I slowly followed the arm up to the face. Keisha looked like a ruin. Her mascara had run down her cheeks in black streaks, making her look like a skull. Her hair, usually sprayed into submission, was unraveling. The white lace of her couture gown was torn at the hem from where she had tripped in her haste to chase me. She did not look like a bride. She looked like a ghost haunting the scene of her own funeral. "You cannot do this, Maya," she sobbed, her chest heaving. "You cannot just throw us out. Where am I supposed to go? Brad is gone. Daddy is broke. I have nothing. I am your sister. We are family. Blood is thicker than water, Maya. You have to help me." I stared at her face, searching for any sign of the girl I used to play with. I searched for the sister who might have once defended me on the playground. But I found nothing. I saw only the woman who had spent 20 years stepping on my neck to make herself look taller. She was not crying because she lost her sister. She was crying because she lost her ATM. I gently but firmly peeled her fingers off my arm as if removing a leech. I took a step back, creating a physical chasm between us that mirrored the emotional one. "It is funny you should mention that word, sister," I said, my voice calm and conversational. I seem to remember a very specific conversation we had less than 2 hours ago. Right in that ballroom. You were standing next to Brad and you were laughing. "Do you remember what you called me, Keisha?" She sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand, looking confused. "I was just stressed. I didn't mean it." I shook my head, cutting her off. "No, you meant every word. You called me a beggar. You asked if I rented my dress. You called me a charity case. You told the entire room that I was a failure who was only allowed inside out of pity. You made it very clear that in your world, I was nothing more than dirt on your shoe." I took a step closer to her, forcing her to look up at me. "So here is the problem, Keisha. You established the rules of this reality. You decided I was a beggar. And by your own logic, a beggar has no money. A beggar has no power. A beggar certainly does not have the resources to house and feed a grown woman who has never worked a day in her life. So how can I help you? If I am the beggar and you are the princess, surely you should be the one helping me." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The trap was perfect. She could not admit I was powerful without admitting she was a liar and a bully. But she could not keep calling me a beggar if she wanted my money. She was paralyzed by her own cruelty. "I am not a beggar, Maya," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I know you have money. Please. I am scared. I have nowhere to go." I looked at her with a detached, clinical curiosity. "You are an adult, Keisha. You have a college degree that Dad paid for. You have 2 arms and 2 legs. You are healthy. I suggest you do what I did when I left this house at 18. Get a job. Rent a studio apartment. Take the bus. Learn how to cook ramen noodles. It builds character." "But I can't," she wailed, reaching for me again. "I don't know how to do any of that." "Then you better learn fast," I replied, stepping out of her reach. "Because the real world does not care about your last name, especially when that name is now synonymous with fraud." I signaled to Corbin, who was standing by the main door, waiting for my command. He stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over her. "Please escort the former bride off the premises," I said, turning my back on her. "And Corbin, make sure she does not take the silver on her way out. Beggars can be tricky like that." "Maya, no. You can't do this." "Maya!" Her screams faded as the heavy doors opened and the cold night air rushed in. I did not look back. I walked toward the library, my sanctuary. I had one last piece of business to attend to before I could finally rest. The house was quiet now. The parasites were gone. And for the first time in my life, the air in the Vanderbilt estate felt clean. I turned away from the open door where my sister had just vanished into the night, but the hallway was not empty. My parents were still there, huddled near the antique coat rack like castaways clinging to driftwood. They had stopped screaming. The rage had evaporated the moment they realized shouting would not work. Now they were pivoting to their secondary strategy, which was manipulation. Reginald saw me look at him and immediately slumped his shoulders, affecting a posture of weary defeat. He walked toward me with his palms open, a universal gesture of harmlessness that looked grotesque on a man who had slapped me an hour ago. "Maya, please," he said, his voice trembling with a performance of fatherly grief. "We need to talk about this calmly. Emotions are high. We all made mistakes tonight. But you have to understand that we were victims too. That boy duped us." He looked me in the eye and lied about his portfolio. "I am just as much a casualty of his fraud as the investors are." Vivian nodded vigorously, her tears drying up as she sensed a possible opening. "Yes, darling. He bewitched us. We only wanted what was best for Keisha. We thought he could take care of her. We had no idea he was a criminal. You cannot punish your own mother and father for being too trusting. We did it for the family. We did it for you too, Maya, so the Sterling name would be safe." I stared at them, feeling a wave of nausea rise in my throat. It was impressive in a sickening way. They were rewriting history in real time, trying to gaslight me into believing they were innocent bystanders in their own corruption. They thought I was still the desperate little girl who would accept any crumb of validation, even if it was wrapped in a lie. "Stop," I said, the single word cracking through their performance like a whip. "Do not insult my intelligence," I heard the recording father. "I heard you in the library. You knew Brad was drowning in gambling debt. You knew he was a fraud. You did not sign those papers because you were tricked. You signed them because you were willing to sell your employees' pensions to save your own reputation. You were not a victim. You were a co-conspirator." Reginald's mouth snapped shut. The mask of the grieving father slipped, revealing the fear underneath. "And you, mother," I continued, turning to Vivian. "You watched Brad mock me. You watched Keisha tear up my gift. You told me to leave my own home because I was an embarrassment. You did not care about the family. You cared about the photos in the society pages. You picked a side. You looked at a criminal in a tuxedo and a daughter with a sketchbook, and you chose the criminal every single time because he looked expensive." I raised my hand and pointed a steady finger toward the open wrought iron gates at the end of the driveway. The security lights cast long shadows, making the exit look like the mouth of a dark tunnel. "You wanted a rich son-in-law. You wanted a merger. Well, you got one. You tied your fate to his ship, and now that ship is sinking. You made your choice. You chose Brad instead of me. So go follow him. Go find him at the police station and ask him for a place to stay." Reginald opened his mouth to argue, but Corbin stepped forward, crossing his massive arms. The threat was clear. My father looked at me one last time, searching for a trace of the daughter he could bully. He found only a stranger made of ice. He grabbed Vivian's arm and dragged her toward the door. I watched them stumble out into the darkness, two shadows fading into the night, leaving me standing alone in the center of the estate I had conquered. The house was finally mine. The heavy oak doors were beginning to close, but the gap was still wide enough for the final act of this tragedy to play out. Reginald was still struggling in Corbin's grip on the front porch, twisting his body around for one last desperate look at his kingdom. He expected to see a room full of outraged friends. He expected his golf partners and his investment bankers to be rushing the exits, demanding justice for the man they had toasted only an hour ago. He expected loyalty. What he saw instead was a masterclass in the survival instincts of the rich. The moment the security guards laid hands on my father, the atmosphere in the ballroom shifted instantly. The fear that had paralyzed the guests dissolved, replaced by a cold, hard calculation. They looked at the weeping mother and the broken father, and then they looked at me, standing on the stage with the deed to the estate and the control of a massive venture capital firm. In their world, net worth was the only moral compass that mattered, and my stock had just skyrocketed while Reginald's had hit zero. The first defection came from Charles Henderson, the chairman of the largest private equity firm in the state, and my father's oldest friend. He had spent every Thanksgiving at our table for 20 years. He had watched me grow up and ignored me every single time. Now he stepped over a piece of Keisha's torn lace dress and marched straight toward me. He did not look at the door where his best friend was being evicted. He did not even blink. He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a gold-embossed business card, holding it out like an offering to a new deity. "Maya," he said, his voice booming with a fake jovial warmth that made my skin crawl. "I must say, I always knew you were the sharp one. That was a brilliant maneuver with the debt acquisition. Truly brilliant. We should do lunch. My firm is looking for new strategic partnerships, and I think MS Holdings would be a perfect fit." I took the card, holding it by the corner as if it were contaminated. "Thank you, Charles," I replied, my voice amplified by the microphone, ensuring Reginald could hear every word from the darkness outside. "I find it interesting that you want to do lunch. Last time I saw you, I believe you told my father that his daughters were decorative liabilities." Charles laughed, a hollow, nervous sound. "Oh, water under the bridge, my dear. Just business banter. The future is what matters." That was the signal the rest of the room needed. It was like a dam breaking. Suddenly, I was surrounded. Men and women who had sneered at me in the buffet line were now clamoring for my attention, thrusting their business cards at me, complimenting my dress, and praising my business acumen. They turned their backs completely on the entrance. They formed a physical wall of black tuxedos and designer gowns blocking Reginald from view. It was the ultimate erasure. To them, he was already dead. He was a bad investment, a cautionary tale, and they were distancing themselves from the fallout with ruthless efficiency. I looked past the sea of sycophants through the sliver of the closing door and locked eyes with my father. He stopped struggling. He went limp in the guard's arms. He was not physically hurt, but I watched the light inside him extinguish. He realized in that brutal moment that these people never liked him. They liked his money. They liked his parties. They liked his influence. And now that I had taken it all, they tossed him aside like a wrapper. He saw Charles Henderson shaking my hand. He saw the society matrons smiling at me. He saw his entire identity being stripped away and handed to the daughter he had rejected. The shame on his face was absolute. It was a fate worse than bankruptcy. It was irrelevance. I held his gaze for one final second. I wanted him to remember this. I wanted him to remember that his downfall did not come from his enemies. It came from the very people he tried so hard to impress. I gave a small, cold nod to the guards. Corbin understood. He gave Reginald one final shove into the night. The heavy doors slammed shut with a resounding thud, engaging the magnetic locks. The sound echoed through the foyer, sealing the past outside. I looked down at the pile of business cards in my hand. They were tickets to the inner circle, the keys to the kingdom my father had spent his life building. I walked over to a nearby trash can and casually dropped the entire stack inside. I did not need their validation. I owned them. I turned back to the crowd who watched my action with stunned silence. Now I said, my voice ringing with power, "Let us discuss the rent." The last limousine taillights faded down the long driveway, leaving nothing but the sound of the wind rustling through the ancient oaks. The catering staff had been dismissed with generous tips and non-disclosure agreements, leaving the ballroom exactly as it was. A silent, chaotic monument to the night everything changed. I stood in the center of the dance floor, my bare feet pressing against the cold marble. I had kicked off my heels near the entrance, abandoning the armor of the corporate shark to finally just be Maya. The room was a graveyard of excess. Half-eaten lobster tails sat on silver platters, and abandoned champagne flutes sparkled under the dim emergency lights. The confetti from the first dance lay scattered like dirty snow. It looked like a battlefield, and in many ways, it was. I had walked into this room as a ghost, and I was the only one walking out as a living, breathing person. I walked slowly toward the head table, avoiding the shards of the glass Keisha had dropped. The silence was heavy, but it was not oppressive anymore. For 20 years this house had been filled with the noise of my father's yelling, my mother's criticism, and my sister's mocking laughter. The silence that filled it now was clean. It was the silence of a vacuum after the dust has finally settled. I reached the main chair, the throne my father had sat in for decades, presiding over dinners where I was ignored. I ran my hand along the velvet upholstery. It felt just like a chair. It held no power. It held no magic. It was just furniture that belonged to a man who was currently probably checking into a Motel 6. A strange sensation started in my chest. It was a tightening, a pressure building behind my ribs. I thought I would laugh. I thought I would throw my head back and scream in triumph like a villain in a movie. But the laugh never came. Instead, a sob ripped through my throat so violent it almost doubled me over. I grabbed the edge of the table to steady myself as the tears finally broke through. They were hot and fast, streaming down my face, washing away the foundation and the perfect contouring. I cried for the little girl who hid in the pantry. I cried for the teenager who was left off the family Christmas card. I cried for the woman who had to turn her heart into stone just to survive the people who were supposed to love her. It was not a pretty cry. It was ugly and raw and loud, echoing off the high ceilings. It was a purge. I let it all out, every ounce of poison they had fed me, until my chest felt hollow and light. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, taking a deep, shuddering breath. The air tasted different. It tasted like freedom. I turned away from the wreckage of the party and walked toward the fireplace at the far end of the room. Above the mantel hung a massive oil painting of my father. I made a mental note to have it burned in the morning, but for now I focused on the small alcove beneath it. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the pieces of the torn drawing Keisha had destroyed. The yellowed paper was fragile in my hands. I placed the scraps gently on the marble mantel, piecing them together as best I could, until the image of the two little girls under the oak tree was visible again. I reached for a half-empty bottle of champagne left on a nearby table and poured a small splash into a glass. Then I picked up a single white rose from the centerpiece arrangement. Nana Rose loved white roses. She used to say they represented new beginnings. I placed the flower next to the drawing and lit a small votive candle that had been part of the decorations. The flame flickered, casting a warm golden glow on the torn paper. I stared at the flame, feeling the presence of the only woman who had ever made me feel safe in this house. She had left me the weapon I needed in her will, but she had left me something more important in my memories. She gave me the permission to be strong. I picked up the glass and raised it to the invisible woman standing beside me. The tears had stopped, leaving my eyes clear and sharp. The war was over. The usurpers were gone. The castle was reclaimed. I whispered into the empty room, my voice steady and filled with a quiet, absolute peace. I did it, Nana. I finally stood up. I took a sip of the wine and blew out the candle, watching the smoke curl up toward the ceiling. I turned around and looked at the empty ballroom one last time. It was a mess, but it was my mess. Tomorrow I would hire a cleaning crew. I would hire decorators. I would paint over the beige walls and throw out the antique furniture that smelled like judgment. But for tonight, I was going to go upstairs to the master bedroom, lock the door, and sleep for the first time in my life without fear. I walked out of the hall, turning off the lights behind me, plunging the Sterling legacy into darkness and stepping into my own light. 3 months. That is how long it takes for a dynasty to turn into dust if you remove the foundation. The snow has melted in Newport, revealing the green manicured lawns of the estates, but the Sterling family is no longer around to enjoy the spring. I read the final sentencing report this morning while drinking coffee on the terrace of my home. The headline was small, buried on page 6 of the local paper right where it belonged. Bradley Montgomery sentenced to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The judge apparently did not appreciate Brad trying to bribe the bailiff during the preliminary hearing. They say he cried when the gavel came down. He sobbed like a child, realizing that his charm, which had worked on my parents for years, had absolutely no value in a court of law. He is currently residing in a 6x8 cell in upstate New York. I heard through my lawyers that he has been assigned to laundry duty. The man who refused to wear anything but custom silk is now washing the soiled underwear of convicted felons for 12 cents an hour. It is a poetic kind of justice that no amount of money could buy. As for the king and queen of the Sterling Empire, their fall was less dramatic but far more pathetic. Reginald and Vivian were evicted 48 hours after the wedding disaster. My security team ensured they took nothing that was not legally theirs, which meant they left with 2 suitcases of clothes and a lot of bitterness. They currently reside in a 2-bedroom walk-up apartment in the industrial district on the wrong side of the bridge. I am told the heating system is loud and the neighbors are louder. Reginald spends his days sitting on a second-hand sofa, staring at the peeling wallpaper, clutching a glass of cheap scotch, and retelling stories of his glory days to anyone who will listen. But nobody listens anymore. The phone has stopped ringing. The country club revoked his membership the day the news of his insolvency broke. He is a king without a kingdom, ruling over a domain of dust bunnies and regret. Vivian has not fared much better. She tried to sell her social connections, but found that her friends were only friends with her money. Now she spends her time haggling with grocery store clerks over expired coupons, trying to maintain an air of superiority while counting pennies at the checkout line. They are trapped together in a cage of their own making, forced to live with the only people they truly despise, each other. But the sweetest karma was reserved for the golden child. Keisha. My dear sister, who thought manual labor was something only peasants did. I drove past a mid-range diner on the edge of town yesterday. I did not go in. I just idled my Aston Martin at the stoplight and watched through the large glass window. It was the lunch rush. Keisha was there. She was wearing a polyester uniform that was 2 sizes too big and an apron stained with grease. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and the diamond earrings were gone, replaced by sweat on her brow. I watched as a heavy-set man at table 4 snapped his fingers at her, demanding a refill on his coffee. Keisha flinched. I saw the old arrogance flare up in her eyes for a second, the urge to scream, "Do you know who I am?" But then reality hit her. She remembered the rent was due. She remembered she had no husband, no daddy, and no trust fund. She swallowed her pride, forced a fake smile, and rushed over to pour the coffee. She looked exhausted. Her feet were likely blistering in cheap shoes, and her hands were chapped from wiping down tables with harsh chemicals. She was serving the very people she used to mock. She was living the life she told me I deserved. I watched her drop a fork and scramble to pick it up, apologizing profusely to the customer who rolled his eyes at her. She looked small. She looked ordinary. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman with no skills trying to survive in a world that no longer handed her everything on a silver platter. The light turned green. I shifted the car into gear and drove away. I did not feel the need to honk or wave. I did not need to rub it in. Her life was the punishment. I accelerated down the highway, the engine purring like a lion, leaving the diner and the past in my rearview mirror. They were ghosts now, fading into the background of a story that was no longer about them. It was finally entirely about me. The sun was beginning to set over the Newport Harbor, casting long golden shadows across the glass desk of my corner office. I was reviewing the quarterly projections for the Sterling Media acquisition, which was now fully integrated into MS Holdings. The numbers were green, profitable, efficient. It turns out that when you stop siphoning money for private jets and gambling debts, the media business is actually quite lucrative. I signed the final page of the report with a flourish of my pen, feeling the satisfying scratch of the nib against the paper. The office was quiet, a respectful, productive silence that I had cultivated carefully. Then my personal cell phone buzzed. It was not the soft chime of a business notification, it was the harsh, persistent vibration of a call coming through on my private line. I frowned. Very few people had this number, and all of them knew better than to call me during executive hours. I flipped the phone over. The name on the screen made my stomach tighten for a fraction of a second before the feeling was replaced by a cold, dull annoyance. Mother. I watched the screen light up and dim with the rhythm of the ring. I could have let it go to voicemail. I could have let her scream her grievances into the digital void. But something told me this was necessary. It was the final loose thread that needed to be snipped. I swiped the green icon and lifted the phone to my ear. I did not say hello. I just listened. Maya, thank God you picked up. Vivian's voice was breathless, shrill, and layered with a panic that sounded half genuine and half performed. You have to help us. The landlord is threatening to evict us again. He says our check bounced. It is a mistake, Maya, I swear. Reginald just forgot to transfer the funds. We cannot be on the street. It is going to rain tonight. You cannot let your parents sleep under a bridge. Just send us 5,000. That is all we need. Just enough to get him off our backs and maybe buy some groceries. We are starving, Maya. Your father is coughing. I think he has pneumonia. I leaned back in my leather chair, swiveling slowly to look out at the skyline. I let her ramble. I let her pour out the lies and the manipulations. She did not ask how I was. She did not apologize for the years of abuse. She did not congratulate me on the business success that was currently featured on the cover of Forbes magazine lying on my desk. She just wanted money. To her, I was still just a resource to be exploited, a slot machine that she hoped would pay out if she pulled the lever hard enough. Maya, are you listening to me? She demanded, her voice rising in pitch when I did not respond immediately. We are family. You owe us. We raised you. We gave you life. You cannot sit there in your ivory tower and watch us rot. Send the money. Send it now, or I swear to God I will go to the press. I will tell them you are a heartless monster who abandoned her sick parents. I smiled. It was a small, sad smile. The threat was so empty it was almost funny. The press already knew the story. They loved the story. The narrative of the phoenix rising from the ashes of a corrupt family was marketing gold. Her threats were like throwing pebbles at a tank. I finally spoke, my voice calm and smooth, devoid of any anger or pity. It was the voice of a CEO addressing a hostile party. Mother, I said, cutting through her tirade, I am listening, and I want you to listen to me very carefully because I am only going to say this once. I do not owe you anything. You did not raise me. You survived me. You tolerated me until you could try to replace me. And as for the money, the bank is closed. Maya, wait, do not hang up, she screamed, desperation clawing at her throat. Just 1,000, please. 500, Maya, please. I pulled the phone away from my ear, looking at the screen one last time. I thought about the little girl who used to wait by the phone hoping her mother would call to say goodnight when she was away on trips. That call never came. This was the closure that little girl deserved. I brought the phone back to my lips for the final verdict. I am sorry, I said, keeping my tone professional and detached. But the subscriber you are calling is currently busy running a billion-dollar empire. Please do not try again. I tapped the red icon, ending the call mid-scream. The silence rushed back into the room, instantly restoring the peace. I did not put the phone down. I opened the contact settings. I scrolled down to the bottom of the screen where the red text waited. Block caller. I pressed it. A confirmation box popped up asking if I was sure. I did not hesitate. I tapped yes. Then I did the same for Reginald. And then for Keisha. One by one, I erased their digital access to my life. I placed the phone face down on the desk. It was done. The bridge was not just burned, it was demolished and the dust had settled. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The city lights were turning on below me, glittering like diamonds in the twilight. They were beautiful, and they were mine. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the air of the summit. I had climbed the mountain alone, carrying the weight of their rejection on my back. Now I was at the top and the load was gone. I turned back to my desk where a new stack of contracts waited. There was work to do, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The conference room on the 45th floor was a fortress of glass and steel suspended above the clouds. From here, the city looked like a complex circuit board, a grid of energy and potential that I now controlled. I stood at the head of the long obsidian table, my reflection staring back at me from the polished surface. I was not wearing the red dress of rebellion anymore. Today I was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, the fabric sharp and professional. I looked like a CEO, but more importantly, I felt like one. Around the table sat the 12 members of the board of directors. These were not my father's golfing buddies or the sycophants who used to populate the Sterling media parties. These were sharks. They were veterans of Wall Street, men and women who had eaten companies for breakfast and destroyed CEOs for lunch. When I first walked in here 3 months ago, they had looked at me with skepticism. They saw a 25-year-old heiress with a scandalous family history. They expected a figurehead. They expected a girl playing dress-up. I pressed the button on the remote, and the holographic projector hummed to life, displaying the Q3 earnings report. The numbers hovered in the air, glowing a vibrant, healthy green. I watched their eyes scan the data. I saw the skepticism evaporate, replaced by a grudging and then genuine respect. As you can see, gentlemen and ladies, the restructuring is complete. I said, my voice steady and commanding, filling the acoustic silence of the room. By liquidating the toxic assets my father had accumulated and severing ties with the fraudulent offshore accounts set up by Mr. Montgomery, we have stopped the bleeding. Operational costs are down 30%. Revenue is up 40%. And for the first time in a decade, the employee pension fund is fully solvent and protected. I paused, letting the last point sink in. That was for Mrs. Gable. That was for the janitors. Mr. Thornton, the most senior member of the board, leaned forward. He was a man who rarely smiled, a titan of industry who had intimidated my father for years. He took off his reading glasses and looked at me. His gaze was piercing. I must admit, Ms. Sterling. He said, his voice gruff but impressed. When you executed the hostile takeover, I was ready to sell my shares. I thought this was just a family feud spilling over into the boardroom. I assumed you would drive this company into the ground just to spite your father. He tapped the report on the table with a heavy finger. But these numbers do not lie. You have done more in 90 days than Reginald did in 10 years. You have a vision, Maya, and you have the grit to execute it. Thank you, Mr. Thornton, I replied, nodding my head slightly in acknowledgement. But let us be clear. I did not do this to spite my father. I did this because this company has potential that was being suffocated by ego and mismanagement. We are no longer a vanity project for a socialite family. We are a media empire, and we are just getting started. I switched the slide to the future projections. I laid out the plan for the new digital streaming platform, the expansion into international markets, and the scholarship program for young artists that I was funding personally. I spoke for 20 minutes without notes, without stuttering, and without fear. I knew every metric. I knew every liability. I owned this information just as I owned the building. When I finished, there was a moment of silence. Then Mr. Thornton started to clap. It was a slow, rhythmic applause. One by one, the other board members joined in. It was not the polite applause of a social gathering. It was the applause of peers acknowledging a leader. They were not clapping because I was a Sterling. They were clapping because I was the smartest person in the room. I looked around the table, meeting their eyes. For the first time in my life, I was not being judged for my shoes or my silence. I was being judged on my merit. I had stripped away the heavy velvet curtains of my childhood and replaced them with this transparency. Hard work, results, integrity. Meeting adjourned. I said, closing the folder. The board members stood up, gathering their things. As they filed out, shaking my hand one by one, offering congratulations and setting up lunch meetings, I felt a profound sense of lightness. I was not Maya the beggar. I was not Maya the black sheep. I was Maya Sterling, CEO. I waited until the last person left the room and the heavy glass doors hissed shut. I walked over to the window and placed my hand against the cool glass. I looked down at the city, at the ant-like cars moving in the streets below. Somewhere down there, my family was struggling with the reality they had created. But up here, the air was rare and clean. I had built a new life out of the wreckage of the old one, and the view from the top was magnificent. The charity gala for the Metropolitan Arts Foundation was the kind of event I used to sneak into. Tonight, I was the keynote speaker. After my speech, I wandered away from the crowded ballroom, seeking a moment of quiet in the gallery wing. I stopped in front of a large canvas painted in turbulent shades of blue and gray. It was chaotic, but in the center, there was a single stroke of bright, defiant gold. It reminded me of the last 3 months. I stood there sipping my sparkling water, feeling the silence of the room wrap around me like a protective shawl. I was not hiding anymore, but I still appreciated the solitude. It captures the feeling of survival perfectly, does it not? The voice was deep and warm, coming from just over my shoulder. I turned around expecting another board member trying to talk shop or a journalist looking for a scoop on the Sterling scandal. But the man standing there was neither. He was tall with messy dark hair that rebelled against the formality of his tuxedo. He held a program in his hand, and he was looking at the painting, not at me. I recognized him immediately. Julian Thorne. He was a tech architect who had built his own company from a garage in Seattle into a global infrastructure giant. He was my equal in net worth, but his reputation was spotless. He was known for being reclusive, brilliant, and fiercely kind. "Mr. Thorne," I said, keeping my guard up out of habit. "I did not know you were an art critic." He turned to look at me then. His eyes were a startling shade of hazel, clear and direct. There was no calculation in his gaze. There was no hunger. He did not look at me like I was a prize to be won or a bank account to be raided. He looked at me like I was a person. "Please call me Julian," he said with a small, genuine smile. "And I am not a critic. I just know what it looks like to fight a storm and win." "I saw your speech, Maya. You did not talk about profits. You talked about integrity. You talked about protecting the people who work for you. In my industry, that is rare." I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It was not the adrenaline of battle or the cold satisfaction of revenge. It was warmth. For the first time in months, I felt my shoulders relax. Most people who approached me these days wanted something. They wanted a job, a loan, or a piece of the sterling pie. Julian Thorne looked like a man who had everything he needed. I did what had to be done. I replied, my voice softer than usual. "Some people think I was ruthless." "You were necessary." He corrected me gently, taking a step closer, but respecting my personal space. "There is a difference between cruelty and justice. You saved a company. You saved jobs. And from what I hear, you saved yourself." "That is not ruthless, Maya. That is heroic." He reached into his jacket pocket. I instinctively tensed, expecting a business card or a pitch. Instead, he pulled out a small silver pin. It was a tiny, intricate sculpture of a phoenix. "I give these to the fellows in my scholarship program," he explained, placing it on the railing between us. "It is a reminder that rising from the ashes is not the end of the story. It is the beginning. I think you earned one." I looked at the small silver bird. It was a gesture of respect, not romance. But in that respect, there was a promise of something more. A promise that I did not have to be the Ice Queen forever. He checked his watch. "I have to go. My board gets nervous if I stay out past midnight. But I would like to continue this conversation. Not about business, just about the art of survival. If you are ever interested in coffee with someone who does not want a single thing from you, let me know." He nodded once and walked away, disappearing into the crowd without waiting for an answer. He left the choice to me. I picked up the silver pin and held it in my palm. It felt cool and solid. I watched him go, and for the first time I did not feel the urge to run. I felt the urge to follow. I realized then that I was not just building a company, I was building a life. And maybe, just maybe, there was room in that life for someone who saw the gold in the chaos. I turned away from the balcony and walked back to my desk, sitting on the edge of the mahogany surface. I looked directly into the camera lens, breaking the fourth wall for the first time. The city lights behind me were a blur of gold and white, but my focus was sharp. I needed to say this. I needed to speak to the person I used to be, and to anyone else who is still trapped in the dark. There is a myth that society forces upon us from the moment we are born. It is the myth that family is a sacred, unbreakable bond. We are taught that blood is thicker than water. We are taught that no matter how much they hurt you, how much they take from you, or how much they humiliate you, that you must forgive them. We are told that you only get one mother and one father, so you must endure their abuse in the name of loyalty. That is a lie. It is a dangerous manipulation designed to keep victims silent and compliant. I spent 25 years believing that lie. I thought that if I just worked harder, if I just achieved more, if I just gave them enough money, they would finally love me. I thought that cutting them off would make me a bad person. I thought it would make me ungrateful. But I realized something in that ballroom when I saw my father choose his reputation over my dignity. I realized that toxicity does not get a free pass just because it shares your DNA. A toxic parent is just a bully who knows your birthday. A jealous sister is just an enemy who sleeps down the hall. Keeping them in my life was not an act of love. It was an act of self-destruction. It was like holding onto a jagged piece of glass and wondering why I was always bleeding. Removing my family from my life was the most violent and painful thing I have ever done. It felt like amputation. But it was necessary to save the rest of the body. You cannot heal in the same environment that made you sick. You cannot build a skyscraper on a foundation of quicksand. My parents were not my roots. They were weeds choking the life out of me to feed their own greed. My sister was not my partner. She was an anchor dragging me down to her level of misery. Some people call me cold. They say I am heartless for letting them struggle while I sit in this tower. But they do not see the years I spent drowning so they could float. Self-preservation is not selfishness. It is the highest form of self-love. It is looking in the mirror and saying, I value my peace more than your approval. I value my sanity more than your expectations. I value my future more than our shared past. If you are listening to this and you are holding on to a relationship that drains you simply because you feel obligated, let go. You're allowed to walk away. You're allowed to change the locks. You're allowed to block the numbers. You do not owe anyone your happiness. The silence that comes after you cut the cord is not loneliness. It is freedom. It is the space where you finally get to meet the person you were always meant to be. I lost a family that never loved me, but I found the woman who finally loves herself. And that is a trade I would make again in a heartbeat. I stepped out of the revolving doors of the MS Holdings Tower and into the morning rush of Fifth Avenue. The city was alive. Sirens wailed, taxicabs honked, and thousands of feet pounded against the concrete. It was a symphony of chaos that I used to find terrifying. Now it sounded like opportunity. I adjusted the collar of my trench coat, feeling the cold bite of the autumn wind against my face. It was bracing. It woke me up. I merged into the crowd, moving with the rhythm of New York. I was no longer the invisible daughter hiding in the shadows of a Newport mansion. I was visible. I was present. I was taking up space and I was not apologizing for it. People often ask me if I regret burning bridges. They ask if I miss the safety of the nest, even if that nest was made of thorns. I look at them, and I smile. I do not miss the fear. I do not miss the feeling of walking on eggshells waiting for the next explosion. I traded a false sense of security for a real sense of worth. Revenge is a popular concept. We love to see the bad guys get punished. We love to see Brad in handcuffs and Keisha in a diner apron. But revenge is exhausting. It keeps you tied to the people who hurt you. It makes you drink poison and hope the other person dies. I discovered something better than revenge: success. Not just the money in the bank or the title on the door. I mean the success of waking up without a knot in your stomach. The success of buying your own coffee with money you earned. The success of knowing that no matter what happens, you can survive because you already have. That is the ultimate weapon. That is the shield that no insult can penetrate. My parents can scream my name to the empty walls of their apartment, but they cannot touch me here. I am out of reach. I have built a fortress of accomplishments that protects me better than any security guard. I stopped at a crosswalk waiting for the light to change. I looked up at the patch of blue sky visible between the skyscrapers. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the exhaust and the possibility of the city. The light turned white. I stepped forward. I did not look back. I never look back anymore. There is nothing back there for me but ghosts. Everything I want is in front of me. If you saw yourself in my story today, if you are currently sitting in a room where you feel small, where you feel unheard, where you feel unloved, please listen to me. You are not stuck. You are not powerless. You are just writing the first chapter of your comeback story. Pick up the pen. Rewrite the narrative. Show them that their doubt was the fuel you needed to ignite your fire. The best revenge is not destroying them. It is building a life so beautiful that you forget they even exist. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. You never know who is looking for the courage to walk away and start over. I am Maya Sterling, and this is my new beginning. Now go out there and create yours. The most powerful lesson from Maya's journey is that loyalty should never come at the cost of your self-worth. We often cling to toxic relationships because of history or bloodlines, believing we can fix them with enough love or sacrifice. But the truth is, you cannot heal in the environment that broke you. True power comes when you stop seeking validation from those committed to misunderstanding you. Walking away isn't quitting, it is choosing to survive. Your greatest revenge isn't their downfall, but your own absolute success. If you are ready to write your own comeback story, hit like and share this video to inspire someone else to choose themselves today.